Well, good evening, folks, and welcome to the School of Exercise Science, Physical and Health Education's Lansdowne Scholar Address for 2012. My name is Rick Bell, and I am the director of the school, and it's my pleasure to introduce this year's Lansdowne Scholar. We're delighted to have Dr. Mary O'Sullivan be our Lansdowne Scholar. She is currently the Dean of the Faculty of Education and Health Sciences at the University of Limerick in Ireland. She's a professor of physical education and youth sport. Prior to moving to Ireland, she was a professor and associate dean of the College of Education at the Ohio State University. Mary, why the hell do they call it the Ohio State University? I've always wondered that.
Yes, we do.
But of critical relevance to this evening, Mary is back with us. Mary started her professorial jobs here at the University of Victoria back in the mid-1980s in the school. So it's nice to have her return. Dr. O'Sullivan's research interests are in teaching, teacher education, and teacher professional development. She's committed to best practices in facilitating teachers to be reflective practitioners and advocates for quality physical education and sport experiences within schools and communities. These research interests have led her to developing learning communities where teachers support each other. Upon arriving at the University of Limerick, Dr. O'Sullivan established the Physical Education, Physical Activity, and Youth Sport Research Centre. This centre allows teachers and researchers to come together to advance the physical and social well-being of Ireland's children and youth. She's currently working with the Irish National Council for Curriculum and Assessment as they develop a national curriculum for senior level physical education. I think, Dr. Gibbons, that we should recruit Dr. O'Sullivan to help us with our initiatives here in the province of BC. Mary is also engaged in the development of educational policies and reform initiatives as they relate to professional development for teachers in Ireland. She is recognized around the world as a leader in physical education, teacher education. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Kinesiology. She's a board member of the International Association for Physical Education and Higher Education. She is the editor of the prestigious Journal of Teaching and Physical Education and a prolific writer of books, monographs, and research articles. And by the way, she's an internationally renowned keynote speaker, having recently talked in Norway, Germany, Turkey, Hong Kong, England, and more locally in Quebec and at the AERA conference in Vancouver. Mary, it's indeed a pleasure to welcome you back to the University of Victoria and the School of Exercise Science, Physical Education as our 2012 Lansdowne Scholar.
I don't recognize that person, quite frankly. I'm going to see if I can manage all of these things here. Evening, everyone. I'm a little nervous. I think it's when you come back to talk to your own that you feel that, and a commitment to the people who've come out on a rainy night, but you're used to the rain as we are in Ireland. So thank you for coming, to all of you, for those of you who are visitors to the university. This is where I live. So this is Ireland, and as Rick said, almost 30 years ago, this university took a chance on me. And they said that somebody who was coming from a neophyte teacher training college, or teacher education college as we call it, might in fact benefit from a master's degree. So in 1979, I came here to do my master's degree. And John Jackson, Bruce Howe, and an education professor by the name of John McLeish were involved in the study of teaching. And that's where I got my start in terms of research and did some descriptive work around teaching. And was lucky enough then to be offered a position as a PhD student at the Ohio State University. More about that. And so, again, this university took another chance on me 3 years later and invited me back to be an assistant professor in this school. And so I'm forever grateful, actually, to this institution. I wouldn't be where I am without that. So I would like to, I suppose, just thank people for that, and I'm deeply humbled to be here. So that's where I'm from, and this is Limerick. And you can see that we're on the front of the estuary of the River Shannon, one of the largest rivers in the country. And on the top right, you're rugby people in this part of the world, and we're very much rugby people as well. And that's the Munster Stadium. It would be, to many rugby aficionados, the mecca of rugby, and that's about 6 or 7 miles from the university. And the bottom right is St. John's Castle. The city of Limerick is very old, and that's about very famous place in the 1600s around what's called the Flight of the Earls, when the Earls of Ireland had to actually flee and went to Europe. So that's a little sense of the city that I come from. And this is the University of Limerick, and while you celebrate your 50th anniversary as a university, it just so happens that we are celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. So we have more things in common than, in fact, that would have been possible. There's about 12,000 students at this university on the banks of the River Shannon. And that's an overview of the institution. And what you can see here, up in this area, that's the River Shannon that flows right through the campus. And you'll see here that this is about 4 years old, this picture. And that little space there now has 3 major buildings, 2 of which I'm responsible for. One is called the medical school, and the other is the health sciences building that has nursing, physiotherapy, occupational therapy, and speech and language therapy, and another beautiful building called the Irish World Academy for Music and Dance. So we've sort of lived, this is the Limerick, County Limerick, and this is County Clare, and you're looking at Tipperary and the hills of Tipperary and the campus. And if you actually look at it, it's actually very similar in its makeup and in its demeanor to UVic. I see lots of similarities of the campus. So that's the sort of the personal biography side. You need to know a little bit about me before, in terms of what I'm going to say. And so the thesis tonight, the argument that I want to try and make is around teachers matter. And why I've chosen this particular topic tonight is because I think all over the world at the minute we are being challenged in schools with regard to the way that we train and educate young people, and that we are being challenged particularly in colleges of education with regard to our relevance and the degree to which we are or are not assisting schools to do the job, and the degree to which we are seen to be relevant by those stakeholders. If we went away tomorrow, would the schools miss us? Right? So I've spent 30 years of my life working with teachers, and a huge commitment and respect for teachers, working with them rather than studying on them, and looking at ways in which schools and teachers and universities and university faculty can actually work together for the betterment of the students and to prepare the kind of teachers that we would want, not just to survive in contemporary schools, but to survive and grow in schools, and in fact to be innovators and change agents. So I want to argue, that teachers matter. I want to talk about, there's no contentiousness about that first bullet. I think everybody believes that teachers matter, and it is incredibly important that we have good teachers if we're going to have student learning. What I think is much more contentious is bullet 2, and that is how and where to prepare teachers. Who should be doing it? Where should it be done? What kinds of things should be involved in the teacher education program? Much more contentious, and I'll speak a little bit to that. And specifically, my talk tonight was about the mandate around school and university partnerships. But partnerships are not new, and I want to sort of reflect on where education has come and look at it from potentially a new perspective. And look at some partnership models in terms of connections between schools and universities and the challenge that brings for colleges of education and universities, but also the challenge it brings for those people who are working in teacher education within the university, as well as the challenge it brings for schools and school leadership, and the degree to which, in fact, it is of benefit and of value to schools. I want to look at what we might learn from other professions. One of the things in my new role, well, it doesn't seem new now, for the last 5 years, one of the things that I do is I oversee the medical school, and I also oversee the nursing school and the School of Clinical Therapies. And I think they are all professions. And in fact, there are enormous synergies between the training and the preparation, the educational preparation of teachers and the education preparation of healthcare professionals. And what can we learn from each other? And I think we can, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then how do we support sustainable partnerships with schools and universities, and what might be the agenda for mutual benefit? So that's sort of the narrative that I'm going to do. I've no high tech. I know Tim might be disappointed with that. I have no videos bumping in and out. What I want to try and do is sort of tell a story and use some of my own experiences relative to that story. So, as I said, partnerships are not new. And so in my preparation for this is a picture of the UVic Normal School. And it's called the Young Building. And I went back and I was looking at, so in fact, teacher education was very much part of the beginnings of this institution. And when it began, it meant that the normal school, where it was sole purpose was in fact preparing teachers to go into schools, was to link up with and amalgamate with the arts and sciences that was a unit or a subsection of, or whatever you want to call it, an affiliate of McGill. And there's a lovely set, I didn't know about them until I was doing some research, there's a lovely set of archives from UVic that actually are stories of people who were the students in the 50s and the teachers in the 50s of the normal school and its connection to Victoria College. I think that's what it was called, Victoria College. And one of the things was that they were fiercely upset about coming into the university. They were upset because there was a unity of purpose for them in education. They were preparing teachers. They knew what their mission was about. It was very clear that was the priority. And their belief was that by rubbing shoulders, this is the actual phrase that one of these characters uses, rubbing shoulders with the arts and sciences would somehow make us better, make us smarter, make us more intelligent. Now, that's 50 years ago. We still have that tension around the preparation of teachers and, in fact, what is it that they need to know. So, in some ways, some of the models I'm going to talk about are back to the future. It's taking, in fact, education out of the university. So, over the years, since we've moved, and Victoria was just one example, since we moved from the normal school, and there were normal schools all over internationally, into the university, things happened. And some of the major critiques, this is the trouble with ed schools, a book that was done a number of years ago, that the curriculum, whether you agree with this or not, these would be many of the critiques of teacher education. The curriculum is in disarray. The faculty are actually disconnected from schools. How many of them have actually been in schools lately? How many of them have actually worked in schools? That they're, in some places, hugely low admission standards. Now, I don't think that that's true at UVic. It was true for some of the programs that were in teacher education at the Ohio State University. It's not true at the University of Limerick. In fact, people coming into physical education, teacher education, people coming in to languages are, particularly if I just take the PE community, they're the third highest cadre of academic students on the campus. The only two that are above them are physiotherapy and psychology. They're the next in terms of the quality of the student experience. If you want to be a primary school, elementary school teacher in Ireland, it is incredibly competitive to get in. So while that might be true in some schools in the United States and in some schools in England, there's now growing concerns. It's not true in Ireland. If you look at institutional quality, Arthur Levine, who used to be the president of Teachers College Columbia, who's now the head of the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, is incredibly critical of colleges of education. And remember, he came as a president out of Teachers College, talking about the low quality of the staff and the quality of the programs. And his argument, whether you agree with it or not, is that the only places, I'm being a bit exaggeration here, the only places really to do teacher education are major research institutions. That's the only place that can do it. I think in the US, I think that would be probably impossible to achieve. There's a critique about the value-added nature of teacher education. Show me, what's the evidence that in fact that a person is better because they've gone through a teacher education program? And we do suffer in education from a set of metrics that will allow us to show the quality of student learning. So if you actually take, which is a very difficult standard to reach, that because they have been in a teacher education program, because they've got accreditation, that in fact the student scores on student learning are in fact better for people who come through an accredited college than people who come from not an accredited college. Now there's a whole series of mediating variables, and we won't go into statistical sort of issues here. There's different kinds of contexts, but it's an argument, and we're not very good in education in terms of sort of making that value-added argument. There are some places, and I don't have time to go into it. And finally, the building status of the College of Education as an academic discipline is often in tension with what will be needed to, in fact, do the kind of work that's needed to be done in terms of working in partnerships. So let me give you a very simple example. If I have a lecture to teach, I go and I teach my lecture and it's 1 hour and I'm done. It's not that I didn't prepare for it or do something thoughtful. But if I am going to do a teacher education program, perhaps I in fact want to do that at a school. So I have to get my students there, I have to get it organized, I have to do all of that, and I have to get back. If I'm doing supervision of student teaching, I might travel for an hour, I might travel for 4 hours to in fact do that kind of work. And so the metrics of universities have changed, and the degree to which in fact it is as young academics as to whether or not the tensions of what is required in a university today and what the requirements of being a good teacher educator are in tension. There may be ways I think we can solve it, but there is a tension. So the debate, if I would sort of suggest that the debate is teaching a profession or is it a craft? Is it a bit of a profession and a bit of a craft? If it's a profession, perhaps it requires more substantial education before one begins to practice. If it's a craft, you learn on the job. How you in fact look at that, or what you in fact foreground, will depend on the kind of teacher education that you can do. But clearly, in the 70s and in the 80s, there was a beginning onslaught, if you like, of critiques of teacher education that I've just talked about in the last issue, that resulted around the world, but I was most familiar at the time because I lived it in the US, in terms of different kinds of provisions for teacher education. And I used to sort of sit in my office as we listened to those critiques, because I was a conscientious young faculty member trying to sort of understand what the issues were. What did I do? And sort of try to understand, why do they hate us so much? Why do they think that we're not doing a good enough job? When you're really working hard to do the job. And trying to sort of understand that from a perspective. And so what happened was we had a whole raft of different kinds of providers of teacher education. You'd be most familiar with Teach for America. But I want to show how from 25 years ago, that has in fact mushroomed in different ways around the world, that we haven't actually stemmed that tide. And in some ways, colleges of education have not understood the degree to which the criticisms of our work, rightly or wrongly, and engaged in that in a way that in fact I think has been good for colleges of education. So teacher education and its relevance. Now, As a consequence of all of these criticisms, these are just a small sampling of the literature over the last 20 years in terms of looking at research on teaching. What do we know? What do we know about teacher education? What might be done? And one of the things that I think we would see is that major sort of shifting conceptions about what teacher education is, moving from what I would call an acquisition model to an inquiry-based model. Moving, for example, from the developing of teaching skills, the old competency-based teacher education, to more of a thinking about the why and the reflecting on what are you doing and why are you doing it. Thinking about moving from learning to teach as a solo act, the classroom, the four walls, the privacy of the classroom, to the notion that in fact teaching is in fact as part of a community of learners, and that we have critical friends and we engage in that. A very different sort of shift, and the kinds of ways that you hold students accountable for it. The notion of moving from what I might call declarative knowledge bases. PJ was telling me that I taught her a class on effective teaching research. So we'd learn all about the effective teaching research, and we'd probably try to do that in the classroom as best we can. To a greater understanding that in fact knowledge is constructed. It's constructed together, it's constructed with the students. The context matters, and sort of understanding that you live in uncertainty. And how do you cope with that as a young teacher, as a young academic, as a young anything, as a neophyte in any profession? You like certainty, understanding that in fact schools are dynamic places, they're complicated places, there is no nice formula. How do you in fact prepare teachers to manage that? And finally, going from discrete assessments of teaching. How much feedback did you provide? What kind of transitions did you make? How much time was there in management? What kind of quality of questioning did you do in terms of those kinds of assessments? To more the notion of authentic assessment in the classroom. The medics have it down in terms of OSCEs. Now, it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but how do we do authentic measures of teaching? And what is effectiveness? That's another couple of hours discussion that we don't have time for today. But fundamentally different ways of thinking about teacher education has been going on for many years. And one of the outcomes of that sort of deliberative work around partnerships was a report by the Holmes Group, a group of deans from major research institutions in North America, and my institution was one of them. Where in fact we talked about tomorrow's schools and how do we better prepare teachers. And there really was, I think, a belief, and they were right, that in fact most of the teacher education in the US at that particular point, and I'll go on to talk about other countries in a minute, but was that in fact the research institution, the Carnegie ones of the world, were training maybe 25 or 30 teachers, and the bulk of the teaching was going on in the comprehensive institution or at other levels that didn't have a research base, and so therefore was more a craft approach to teaching. And so this was an effort to sort of move away from this and say we can't train or prepare teachers in schools without, in fact, partnerships with schools. And this was called the Professional Development School Movement. And the professional development school movement was, in fact, now that colleges of education had to talk to school districts, had to talk to schools, and had to engage with them, and had to listen to them about what they thought about how well we were or were not preparing teachers, and what we would do. And there were four key fundamental sort of missions for professional development schools. We were now about the shared preparation of teachers, as distinct from going into the school, doing the supervision and coming out, using it as a place, but a shared profession of teaching, but fundamentally that faculty and teacher development was in fact important. And that meant that in fact teachers in schools became teacher educators. And the title that was used at the time was, some of them would in fact become clinical educators. And if you think about medicine and clinical tutors, you can begin to see that the potential sort of similarities. And the last two bullets were that in fact schools would now become places of inquiry, and that together teachers and teacher educators and student teachers would in fact look at what are the big challenges that we're facing and how might we together begin to address them. And listen to what the teachers saw to be the challenges, rather than me as the academic from the outside coming in and saying, I think we should be studying X. And finally, not to forget that why are we in schools in the first place, which was the enhancement of student learning, and could we together create a sort of an ethos in those schools? That was what PDSs were about. At Ohio State, we had the dean by the name of Nancy Zimpher. She was my dean. I learned a lot from her. I've been very lucky in my life in terms of learning from people. And one of the things that I learned from her was that she said, you know, if we're going to solve this thing called teaching, we better understand and talk to the unions, because in fact teachers have unions, and teachers and unions are powerful. And if you want to make change, you have to have them with you. You do not want to be fighting them. She understood that, and she spent years developing positive, sustained, real, authentic relationships with union leaders. And she said, and you have to understand the pressures that principals and superintendents are under in order to, in fact, make that work. And so we in the university decided that there was no one kind of professional development school. So in the course of a number of years at the university, we designed 5 different kinds of professional development schools. And the one that I was very much involved in was called EPHE. Franklin County was the county in which we lived, and it was Franklin County Academy of Physical Education Teachers. So we got about 25 teachers from the variety of different school districts. You could imagine how this would work here. And together we sat down and talked about, what are your issues? What are your problems? What do you want us to help you with? And how might we together design the teacher education program that would actually work in your schools? Another group of academics in the college worked with 2 schools who were elementary schools and designed a teacher education setting there. And one of the teachers was employed half-time, so we took her out of her 5-day-a-week job teaching class, and 2 days a week she actually taught in the university. And she was in fact doing the professional development in the university, and 3 days at the school. Now, today people are talking about, well, maybe we should have academics who in fact spend part of their time in schools and part of their time not in schools. And we might say, well, they're better off. I don't want to get into the argument of whether they're better off or not better off in that situation. But if you in fact look at medical education as a nice example, we have, for example, I just hired 9 clinical professors for medical education, and I hired them for 50% of the time. And 50% of the time they work in the hospital. They do clinical teaching in the hospital, and in the 50% they're paid for that, and the other 50% of the time they do teaching of the medics and they do research. There's a credibility in the hospital, there's an absolute connection to the hospital, there's a joint payment around this. I wonder if we would get education faculty in contemporary North America to engage in that sort of process. I know that when we talked about this in our College of Education, I nearly had a riot in my hands, right? Because it is such a fundamental shift. But there are some young academics for which I think this would be brilliant, because they're teachers who would want to, in fact, want to work at the university, but don't want to give up the job in schools. And it would be a lovely sort of way of thinking about it. So just a thought to keep in mind. So PDSs have been going on for a long time, and what happened to them? Well, one of the critiques of the PDS was that it was a local, one university, one school. And I remember thinking, my God, I've spent all of this time and it's one school or it's 16 teachers. You know, how do we scale it up? There was really no way to scale it up because the funding system didn't allow it. It excluded a group of partners that I think in hindsight we just simply didn't think enough about, and that is partners in terms of parents and the larger community. How do you involve the larger community? It takes a village to raise a child. You've heard that phrase before. I think in fact it takes a community in terms of doing quality teacher education. And the huge critique of PDSs was that in fact it didn't pay enough attention to social justice and equity issues. And in fact, it was more about student achievement in its narrower sense than about issues of equity in schools and in the communities, particularly in urban challenging schools that we were working in. And so that was the critique. Now, there have been lots of other international partnerships, and I just want to give you sort of a brief sort of synopsis of where they've been. If you look at Singapore, for example, there's one initial teacher education entity in Singapore. One. You've now got, when I was here in whenever I left, 86, there were 3 universities doing teacher ed. Now I understand there are 9, is that right? 9. In my country, we have 18 providers of teacher ed, we just went through a major international review and a national sort of, and the recommendation is we go to 6. So keep that in the back of your head in terms of these partnerships. So in Singapore, there's 1, and the government works with those schools to ensure that, in fact, there are tutors in the schools to provide the supervision for the students in the schools. The academic in the National Institute of Education doesn't supervise. Well, that's right, wrong, or indifferent. That doesn't happen. If you look at Australia, if you're sort of critical pedagogy, action research, Stephen Kemmis, Carr, those folks way back, they were very much involved in fact, the development of school-university partnerships where they, in fact, the schools, probably about 10 or 11 universities, about 100 schools, worked together and looked at what were we trying to do in teacher education. It was the teacher as the scholar. It was that kind of positioning. If you look in Finland, if you want to be a teacher in Finland, you have to have a master's degree. You cannot go near schools until you have a master's degree. And that final year is working in schools, but it's also working on a research topic that is relevant to teaching and to the schools that you're in. And that the whole notion being that you are developing inquiry teachers who will continue to go on to ask questions and to shape and reshape the schools. In the Netherlands, if you're Fred Carthagen would be one of the major key characters in that space, and very much about the engagement of students as reflective practitioners from that perspective. In Ireland, we send students to schools, we go in and we do our supervision, we hope that the teacher will show up and be there, and so it's a host system. Right? Now, we're absolutely in the throes of rejigging that, and so my work is cut out for me. There's no fear about that for the next several years. But we have some very good people and very smart people, and we'll see how that works. So that's been a set of partnerships, and if you actually, before I go there, what I want to sort of finish up this section by saying, so what has happened around the world? Clearly, there's been a sense that we need to engage differently with schools in ways that will, in fact, provide better teachers for those schools. What I think potentially was missing is 2 things. One was a formalized structure that would allow this to be sustainable over time. And the second was really looking, if I'm a principal or I'm a superintendent, I want to know, show me that in fact this is worth my while, that in fact there is something in this for me. I'm not sure that we've done that so well. Just about 7 years ago now, I was talking about Arthur Levine earlier. In the States it began. It's since gone to England in a much different kind of version, where we had another raft of critique of teacher education and not doing the job. And what we had in the US, which I would call the philanthropic answer, has been major millionaires and billionaires, a commitment to education and a commitment to teaching, coming together in different not-for-profit organizations and for-profit organizations saying, if the colleges of education aren't going to do it, we're going to do it. Rightly or wrongly, whether you agreed with it or not, that's actually what happened. So I think, again, the major institutions began to see the writing on the wall, that they were losing control here, that in fact if this was allowed to continue, if they didn't be seen to be reporting back that things would in fact that colleges of education would become irrelevant in the preparation of teachers. And so in 2009-10, we had the development of what we call the Blue Ribbon Task Force. Now what I want you to look at here and pay attention to is the words, the choice of words that matter. So the clinical preparation and partnership for improved school learning. Back in the 80s, they didn't want to use the medical model. And we could critique the medical model for all kinds of reasons. But now they decided that they were going to take on board the medical model because they argued that people could relate to the medical model. And I don't mean the medical model in terms of a biological model. I don't mean that. But the medical model in terms of how people understood how universities and hospitals trained doctors. And so they began to argue that, in fact, teaching is now back as a practice-based profession. And if you think about, from that perspective, looking at simulations, case-based teaching, videotape of teaching, different kinds of ways, looking at classroom experiences in terms of observations, internships, etc. And this is fascinating. They use this to make the point. He who studies medicine without books sails uncharted sea, but he who studies medicine without patients does not go to sea at all. Now, the Flexner Report in the early 1900s was a fundamental sort of tsunami for medical education and fundamentally reshaped how it was done. I'm not suggesting that medical education is perfect by any stretch. But this was, in fact, meant to be the new tsunami for teacher education. And so it argued that we should, in fact, be guided by mentors, looking at simulated and real classroom experience. And I was explaining to somebody the other day, I walked in on a medical education seminar there recently, and they were, in fact, looking, these were young first-year students, and they were learning to do breast exams. And they were on the tables, and they had this absolutely marvelous simulation of the breast. And so there's this young woman lying on the bench. There was a young man, a young prospective doctor, and he was doing the breast exam. And in this little simulation, there were different cysts and different consistencies and different things, and he would have to ask the right questions, and she'd have to sort of say whether or not it was happening or so on and so forth. Now, when I ask you the question, and there's lots of others, there's simulations in surgery and so on, what might be appropriate simulations in education? Right? We have a long way to go relative to that. And so the design principles, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but focus on student learning, that the core experience is clinical practice. We've gotten away from teaching practice, clinical practice. Teachers expert in how to teach. We're learning in learning communities. We've got clinical educators, and these are teachers who work in schools who are helping us. Selected sites to support the learning to teach, and strategic partnerships, here we go, unions, schools, and HEIs. Don't forget the unions. And now the argument was, if these are to be sustainable, then what we actually need is, in fact, government intervention. In the same way, when I talked to Oscar Casero, who runs your medical center here in collaboration with UBC, or UVic in collaboration with UBC, however political way is the right way to say that. The point I want to make is that for him, working with the hospital has been a fascinating sort of enterprise. And I'm asking, how did you do that? Because you don't pay them a lot. So what happened? So what can we learn in education? I think there's much to be learned. So hold on, I'll get there, right? So what's going on in England? These are the national, in terms of the principles, and the Blue Ribbon Task Force then said, we're now going to have national teaching schools. You all know what a teaching hospital is. You know what that concept is. Now we have national teaching schools, trained mentors, shared commitment to learning, leading edge research, blurred boundaries of initial teacher ed and professional development, and a funding model supported by the state. Right? So that's the process. There is now, if you Google again Ken Zeitner, who is absolutely incredibly critical of the new philanthropic initiatives around teacher education. You will see that, in fact, if you want to do good teacher education, there is no philanthropic entity that will, in fact, work with colleges of education. But there are loads of philanthropic entities that will actually work with So how have we lost that commitment along the way? What have we done or not done, as the case may be, in terms of that commitment? In England, They don't have the philanthropic. But fundamentally, what England did was, from a policy perspective, if you go all the way back to Margaret Thatcher, the notion was that, in fact, teaching was a practical profession. Universities were not doing the job. It would be much better if, in fact, you did it in the schools. They've gone significantly further now in terms of that perspective. By what they've actually done is the development of these teaching schools. And just in a simple sense, because I don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but the notion is that you can now be a teaching school with a certain set of criteria. You gather together, and your job is to work with another set of schools to help them deal with the kinds of demands that they have in schools. So school-to-school mentoring, helping teachers learn and develop it, and particularly around technological expertise and so on and so forth. And you will actually get funding from the government to engage in that process. And what you then work as a set of what we call a school alliance. And part of your job might be professional development for teachers. Part of your job might be initial teacher education. And if you choose to go down that path, the government will pay you, the school, to do the initial teacher education. And then you, as part of the criteria, must, what's the word I want to use? Negotiate with, partner with a university. But you do it on your terms. On your terms. Fundamental shift in power in terms of partnership models. So what's the ambition in England at the minute? They already have 100 schools up and running. They wanted 200 schools in 2012. What they did in terms of colleges of education, an interesting lesson for us. They said there's only X number of school teachers that they want in England. So they said, okay, we want these schools to be preparing these teachers, so we're going to take part of the cohort of teachers that are normally done in teacher education colleges in England, and we're going to decrease that number. Decreased it across the board for dozens and dozens of colleges of education, and for some, they've done this over the last 3 or 4 years to where the point that they are no longer viable. So a number of teacher education entities in England have closed down that particular job that they do. Now, interestingly, this year, for the first time ever, the government gave them back some of their quota. Why? Because the assumption was that all schools would be running to do teacher education. Do they have the time? Do they have the expertise? Do they see it as their priority? Obviously not enough yet, but the goal is to have about 500 of these teaching schools by 14-15, and to drive significant improvement in the quality of schooling, CPD, but also initial teacher education. The funding model then is a government grant annually, and they will receive extra money if they in fact engage in teacher education. So you can see that there's a whole slew of different partnerships, and I've put on the left-hand side sort of partnerships that I described as the Irish model, the host model, but I suspect you could relate to that in some ways. The next model is sort of the coordinator model, where the school takes a supervisory role, but the university has provided all the materials and so on and so forth. Down to, at the very end, the training school model, where in fact the school decides on what teacher education is going to be. And so where do we fit within that particular approach? So what then, in terms of what's going on internationally, are the challenges for us at the university? I think we have to think about the relevancy of our teacher education programs. We have to look at the locus of power shift between schools and universities. It doesn't have to be a tug of war, but we at least have to recognize that they are partners in this endeavor. And if, for example, when I engage with the hospital that I'm working with our school, with our teaching hospital, for every student that walks into that hospital, we give a particular part of our budget. That part of the budget is given over so that, in fact, they can provide the tutoring. So there's a clinical tutor in the hospital. There is equipment, there's support in the library, etc., etc., etc. Now, I could imagine if you're anyway senior leadership in the institution, you're thinking, oh my God, we don't have enough money in the College of Education as it is, now to give a portion of it away to the schools. It's it's a major dilemma. But when I think back to how our clinical tutors in nursing and midwifery and in occupational therapy and so on are, all of those, those professions do not do the majority of the supervision in the hospital or in the community setting. There are what we call practice education coordinators and regional facilitators and nurse preceptors. They have all kinds of terms for them. But the bottom line is they are employed not by the university. They're employed by the health service to in fact do that work in schools. So could you imagine that in fact, so schools don't have enough money to live on as it is, so now you have to have a government mindset that will actually say that the training, the education, I don't want to get into the words between training and education, but the education of teachers is in fact an expensive endeavor. We may not be willing to pay the kind of cost per student for education as we are for the training of a medic, but we need to come somewhere closer in that perspective. So, to me, that's one challenge for the university. The second challenge for the university is this thing around the tension of the school-university culture. Now, I understand from another conversation I know I had with Leslie Blown earlier this week, we're talking about major national initiatives around community-based scholarship and what that might look like. So it seems to me that as universities, if we want to continue to do this work, if we want to see that teacher education is in fact part of our civic engagement with our community, then we have to have some metrics that allow young faculty to not only survive, but thrive in the university with a commitment to schools and schooling issues, and that they can do there. So we need some kind of evaluation then of how do we look at this shared funding when ITE's, initial teacher education, is already constrained in its funding. How do we do that? And how do we then engage in what I would describe as deeper engagement with schools around curriculum reform? I'm fascinated to, in fact, read the BC Education Plan and to look at what's being suggested in terms of ideas around that. And this is going on exactly in Ireland. But the degrees to which some education faculty actually know what's going on and appreciate the curricular dynamics. If they don't, it's not about just knowing. It's about helping to shape that and engage in that in order for, in fact, schools to have a legitimate partnership. That's the policy perspective. That's the impact. Universities now talk about impact, knowledge transfer. I would argue that's a fundamental part of knowledge transfer and impact. So what then are the opportunities for schools? The opportunities for...
Do you mind just moving the mic? It's just rushing a little bit.
Why do hospitals get involved in being teaching hospitals? It's prestigious. There's a branding. There are benefits to the clinicians. Simple benefits, not always monetary. Simple benefits like, for example, Oscar does exactly what we do at the University of Limerick. They get a title. The title is a title to the university. They're an adjunct instructor, they're an adjunct whatever. There's different levels of titles. They have a title. As part of the institution now, they have benefits. They can access the library. You might not think that that's unimportant. They can access the library. With video conferencing technology, they can do grand rounds. I'd like education people to begin to think about grand rounds in the sense of key challenges and that we're all engaged in that. There is a cohort of teachers in schools that would love that intellectual stimulation and how we sort of figure that out. We would have to have a differential funding model. And what I mean by that is that, in fact, if you are engaged in this work, there is some way that in fact, those costs are covered. And there's a staff development support system that allows alliances and so on and so forth. So schools have to see that, in fact, their agenda is being addressed. And that means sometimes, we get off center stage and they get on center stage. And we engage in that process. So the challenges for schools, of course, are easy. multiple demands. There's already increasing demands. And now we don't teach about subject matter, we teach critical thinking, problem solving, civic engagement, responsibility, and sensitivities towards diversity, attending to an inclusive environment, how to work with people who are different than yourself and respect them, all of those kinds of things. Do they have the leadership capacity? How do we in fact engage in that? Who is it their responsibility? Should they be involved in this? Hospitals see that they have to be responsible for the training and preparation of doctors. Do schools see that this is important? Is there a benefit to them? The reason that residency programs and philanthropic programs in the US has worked beautifully is because schools, and in England this is going to be the same thing, schools want certain kinds of teachers. They want more science teachers, more math teachers, more language arts teachers. They want teachers who can, with multiple languages. They want people with special needs, and they want them to be able to work in their context. So if they can recruit the kind of people that they want, they can, in fact, get the kind of people that they want to work in their school. Now, we could deconstruct that, we could unpack that, we could talk about some of the difficulties of all of that. Don't have time today. But at least to get you thinking relative to those issues. So, can universities help schools? If the answer to that is no, then from the principals and superintendents, we have a problem. Are there branding benefits for them? Are they going to be able to manage their stakeholders? For example, will they be able to sell this to parents? Will they be able to sell it to the community in terms of it being valuable? So where to now? I'm getting close to finished. Oops. I'm almost finished. So where to now from that, all of that I've talked about? Clinical staffing in schools. The notion that in fact some teachers in schools would be teaching at the university, and some university people would be teaching in schools. The notion, as I've just said, that CPD and ITD are blurred boundaries. One of the best ways that I found in doing professional development for teachers was in fact doing a course that I did for years with them in terms of supervision of young teachers. What were the philosophical underpinnings of supervision of young teachers? What were the kinds of skills that they might need in terms of observation and assessment? All the focus was on the young teacher, but because they were doing that, that focused it on the question, and how do I do that? And what might we do differently? The funding model. How do we sort of manage a funding model that in fact will now get the universities to in fact give up some of the little bit of money that they have in order to engage in some meaningful way with schools? That in fact schools aren't expected to do this from an altruistic point of view. It's not sustainable from that perspective. The Australian model, by the way, has in about a year and a half ago, they looked at these huge partnerships that they've been doing for 20 years. And one of the proposals that's come forward is in fact a national partnership agency that would commit 20 million per year to in fact sustain these partnerships, provide the training, provide the support, etc., etc. I don't know where it's gone, but it's an interesting proposition. And a shared research agenda around the things that are of interest to schools and teachers. And alliances then between schools where there's peer-to-peer sharing of ideas and the sharing of expertise. Don't want to talk about that. This is my last slide. So I want to leave you with, I suppose, the question, what kinds of experiences can be organized by schools, by universities, colleges of education and staff, and communities that can effectively shape student-teacher skills and knowledges in ways that will elicit what I would describe as concerns in them that concern as a good launch pad for joint reflection within the professional community. Not just to survive within the school, but to grow. And can these schools and colleges of education arrange these experiences in ways that are mutually beneficial over time? So I hope I've given you something to think about over the last little while. Thank you very much.
questions or some comments, so we'll just open it up to the floor. Please.
A thought that I had, with what you're talking about, with what to do with students, I can't argue with what I'm seeing here. I think one of the things that worries me is what do you do, how do you get the teachers ready to work with these students? Because some teachers have been there 20, 30 years and not necessarily have kept up with the changes that occur in the best ways to educate kids. And when you set up a program like this within the school, you have to have the mentors up to snuff. So how do you guarantee that? Because that's not necessarily the case.
When I applied for my job at the University of Limerick, I was asked exactly that same question about the staff that I was going into. And I think it's not just schools. And my answer to that is, and my answer then was, there'll be a few people who want to get on the bus. So we'll get on the bus together, we'll try and figure out the direction that we want that bus to travel. And if that bus is going in the right direction, we'll get the not so sure people to maybe join us on the bus. And there'll be some people who never want to get on the bus. But you don't waste your energy on the people who don't want to get on the bus. So schools have a mandate now for professional development. Schools are challenged with changing their pedagogies, moving from the student as passive to active learner. So I think we start with the willing schools, the schools that are interested, and we take that cadre within the school that we will work with, and we'll do it as a team. There's university folks that don't want to do this either. So don't let's kid ourselves that in fact it's the school. So I think it is a shared commitment by starting small and figuring out how to do this and bringing it along. Now there's a part of me, I'm always sort of a ground up kind of person, but there's a part of me that says this is serious enough that we need some top down kind of policy. And when you have incentives, like the example I tried to use might be a silly example, but with the clinicians, they're already making lots of money. It's not the money, it's the sense of a commitment to being engaged with the next generation of teachers. That in fact, having this person in my school, I might be able to give back a little. And there's lots of teachers who are committed to that kind of an initiative. And you don't spend your energy worrying about the others.
Sometimes it's not that there isn't a willingness, it's that they're not up to
The capacity.
Yeah, to mentor somebody coming in with what is needed now, and you're still back in the dinosaur. I mean, there might be a few back there, but they're not quite where they should be to really.
You're absolutely right, and I think that kind of building of that capacity is part of the professional development that needs to be done. And with, I was just looking at, again, I fall back on my medical sort of groups at the moment, because we do have things in common that we can learn from. And so my head of school hired young docs who were literally, this is the absolute opposite than what we would do, young docs who were just 1 year or 2 years out of their internship to provide the clinical experience for the young docs. They could relate to each other. What do? We bring in retired principals. Now, I have nothing against retired principals. I have nothing against retired principals at all. But the notion that the young academic, the young scholar, the young teacher can't do this, I think, is a fallacy.
Well, I know I supervise student teachers, and there are some very, very good student teachers out there, and they teach me a lot, so I just agree with that.
Other questions or comments for Mary?
I've got a comment. I just graduated in the elementary program, and one thing I've noticed in talking to my friends in classes is the toughest topics, things like differentiated instruction. You know, you're going to have a few gifted students, middle range, and then all your struggling learners. And ideally, the best teacher is able to address all these different kids. And here's my kinesthetic people, here's my music people, you know, I think a bit more modeling of that would have been nice. Like, yeah. the best professors that I saw, one of them was in this room, with someone that, you know, got us up and doing things and showed us how she would talk to different students differently, right? And approach, you know, some of us in different ways, depending, because she knew, you know, how we learned better. And another one was a PowerPoint on the importance of engagement. And not using PowerPoint in elementary school. And you're like, oh my gosh, like, look at what we're doing.
Hands up, absolutely, very well said. We, at Ohio State and at UL, one of the things that we do in our physical education, teacher education program is what we call live the curriculum. So undergraduate students who are training to be PE teachers, this could happen, it doesn't matter the discipline, have to learn about different kinds of sports and physical activities. So we teach it through a curriculum models approach. So they actually do sport education, or teaching aids for understanding, you know, they live it. So they live the curriculum, and in some way, in the same ways they live pedagogy. Now, another bit of an extreme from that is, if those of you are interested, you might look up the Relay Graduate School of Education. It's a real school, I'm not joking, it's a real school, the Relay Graduate School of Education. And the title of their new modules, I was looking at one, it was fascinating, the application of procedures. And so they had videos of teachers in schools doing engagement, the wait time, the famous wait time of the research of 25 years ago, and showing a teacher, showing how to do that. How you position that work and how you talk about it in a teacher education program. The Relay Graduate School of Education would argue it's in New York, and it's fundamentally focused on preparing teachers for urban schools. Would fundamentally say colleges of education have stopped doing that, and they've simply focused on reflection. And we have forgot to in fact provide, as part of the experience, the actual, I would call them, for want of sort of being screamed at sometimes, the technical aspects of the teaching. It's not that it's a technical approach, it's the technical aspects of teaching, of practicing it, and getting feedback, and seeing it. And of course, one of the huge challenges for us in teacher education is finding good sites, but unless we finally do these partnerships, we won't find these good sites in ways that are scalable enough. So we have to be part of developing the site. It's like the grow your own site, rather than complaining that they're not there. So, point well taken.
I think you have some phenomenal ideas and not being involved in teaching or just from the public. Something really struck me that you said, and that was that in one of the first processes you went through, you left out the community. Now, the way I see after this presentation is that the community is really the resource that's going to change what you're really at the top of the pyramid. And there's a disjoint between the two, because, you know, how many people are just here from the public that, like, this is a phenomenal approach, and to be able to implement something like that, who's not going to want to see their child in a world that we live in now? And so the community is still, there's a couple of those slides that still left out the community.
Yeah.
And
I was with, I think it might have been one of Kathy's students earlier in the week, who's engaged in how do we help students to understand what, this is my description of what she's doing, Kathy might tell me later that I'm totally off the wall, but in fact, the assets of the community, and using the assets of the community help the students to understand the community. So let me give you one example of what I've done for years and what we do in our school. It's called community mapping. So what we do in community mapping is, before the student ever goes out into the school, their first assignment is community mapping. So they go to that particular small town or village or whatever city, and they have to actually map. And I literally mean map geographically, walking and talking and finding out what are the kinds of community organizations, what are their These are PE teachers, but it could work in anything else. What are the facilities that are available? What kinds of things do they do in connection with the school? And when they come back to develop their lesson plans and their unit plans and all of these kinds of things, how do you build in what you've just learned about the community and the families into your lesson plans and so forth? And Kathy's student is engaged in getting the students, these young prospective teachers, in terms of talking to the community members and understanding what they are bringing to the lives of kids, to understanding the school, to understanding the communities in which they live, and how does that inform the way they go about teaching. So it's absolutely as an essential piece, and we're still learning how to do that. And the one thing I would disagree with you on is, we need to get away from the notion that we're the top of the hierarchy. That in fact together, somehow, and not just think it's a cliche, but together that we're actually, we're not necessarily equal partners, but we're certainly important partners in this enterprise.
We have the same goal, long term.
Yes.
Not that I'm doing the teacher education so well, but I am segueing off that is because we did some school-based physical activity and health eating things, and we did a capacity assessment, and we wanted to look at this notion of community practice and collaborative work in connection with community and champions and things like that. And we found that in reality, the rhythm of the school is not well matched to community partnerships and linkages. You know, when you're in the school, the teacher basically walks in, they're prepping, they're seeing, there's a couple students already drifting in from the kids that came earlier, parents dropped them off, or the kids that need breakfast, or whatever it is, and they're in there trying to get ready, talk to the principal, and the 4 kids that are drifting in, and then it's all going on, and then in their break, there's 3 kids and this and that, and photocopying, and lunch is not really a lunch break, and there isn't really a rhythm that fits very nicely.
Well, there's their rhythm and there's your rhythm, and they don't mesh very well.
It just doesn't work that easily to really go outside, because by the time the teacher leaves in the elementary school, because that's most of my experience, is, you know, they've just been going full tilt boogie since 10 to 8 to 4:30, and then you want them to use technologies that link them, or have meetings. If they can't, they're not that reachable, or it's difficult to do email unless it's at night, and so there's a lot of barriers to these kind of
there are,
partnerships.
and I mean, the same barriers you're describing in terms of the culture of the school and the culture of the university are, in fact, they're not dissimilar.
Mm.
So one of the things I talked about is that if you're going to do this seriously, then teachers can be expected to do this on top of what they already do.
Right.
So you re-envision the job description. So just like I described the clinical professor, he's got a hectic life. He's got patients that want to see him. In some ways, you know, I'm worried about the kid, whether they can spell or whether, you know, that they're okay or whatever. He's worried about whether he's got to do surgery in 10 minutes on a heart patient, right? So he's got his rhythm. But we've re-envisioned his job or her job. And I think if we're going to do this seriously, we need to re-envision the nature of the roles of different people. So one of the things that we did a number of years ago, well, I didn't do it, my colleague Darrell Siedentop did it, when he went up to Cleveland to talk to a group of teachers about a different kind of teacher education, a different kind of physical education teacher, that said, well, actually, a lot of your work will be after 4. There was nearly, you can imagine, there was nearly a riot. They were calling for the union leaders. What do you mean? But in other words, that in fact, we think differently about how we use schools, about the kinds of people who are in at different times, and what their roles are, and so that we try to relate to it. So you're right. As it currently is, it isn't workable, and it must be incredibly frustrating for you. But if we want to do it, then we have to change the work practices of both of us. If it was easy, we'd have done it a long time ago.
So last question maybe, what should schools look like in the next 10 years? 10 years ahead, how would you say a school would look like that starts to adapt to the type of model that you're advocating?
I don't know, Tim.
That's why we brought you here, just to give
I don't know if you've ever looked at any of Ken Robinson's stuff.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's worth. So answering your question is very difficult if you sort of re-envision the nature of schools as sort of structures. But what I would really like to see, while I can't talk about schools because I think schools will change fundamentally, is that in fact there is a blur between professional development and initial teacher education. That in fact part of my life will be in the school as well as at the university, and part of the teacher's life, some of them, will be in the school and in the university. So that's just us going this way, it's them coming our way. And a way that the university has figured out, because we're smart enough to be able to do it, figure it out that in fact it will address the rankings, it will address the metrics and the kinds of things that make us a legitimate, relevant part of our region and our nation. And so we have to figure that out. So that's sort of, but the roles will change and the timing will change. And what's, you know, what a teacher's job is will be a little different, and what our job will be a little different.
I also see, just on that question, more of living between K-12 schools in our province. So that I had experiences with teachers going from an elementary situation, staff taking their kids down to a high school situation and bringing them back. And that is a joy to see that type of interaction, that type of learning. And the instructors at a grade 12, 11 physics case, we talked about catapults in grade 4 or 5 classes. So I concur with the comments of not only community-based, but bringing those schools and linking together as families of schools and a linear approach to learning and seeing.
The old Summerhill model, you know, you didn't have a school at all. You just had people tracking through their particular themes and interests, and yeah. So I mean, there's so much creativity out there that, and I think. I do think one of the things in terms of governments, in terms of their changing, if I understand BC, less prescription, more authority to teachers. Now, more authority to teachers theoretically sounds wonderful, but if you don't provide a structure and if you don't provide them with that sense of empowerment, you'll have chaos.
Yeah.
And so it's figuring out a way. I remember, this will be my last comment, I had a PhD student, and I asked them to look at this. It was called Leaving Cert Applied program. It was a wonderful Leaving Cert Applied program, but it was for kids who weren't academically inclined. It was for kids to keep them in schools. And it had a leisure and tourism sort of model. And I remember back to BC years ago, they had a lovely sort of system. And she said, this is an awful thing. There's nothing in it. And I said, you know, give it a little bit of thought, give it a little. And eventually, because all the stuff wasn't there, laid out, she had dismissed it, but then she in fact saw that the key objectives were there to allow her to take the kind of kids she was working with, the kind of school that she was in, and she was smart enough to figure it out, that in fact she could design an absolutely wonderful program. That really is good, but it's got an awful reputation. So it's, you know, it's both. It's not just the structure, it's the status of things that we need to change over time. People have been very good.
Mary, thank you so much. We see an interesting junction in time and space. Mary alluded to the proliferation of teacher education institutions. We have an oversupply of teachers in this province. It's going to be interesting to see where change is going to stem from, whether it's going to be mandated from outside to the universities, or whether we heed some of the challenges that you've posed to us this evening and create something that is indispensable to the preparation of teachers in British Columbia here at the University of Victoria. Mary, thank you so much for a very eloquent presentation. It's a privilege to hear somebody who has a perspective that is literally across the world, picking models to compare and contrast, pick what is relevant and meaningful to teacher education here in BC. So on behalf of everybody tonight, thank you again for a wonderful presentation.